The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the distant ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like a storm about to break. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the witness stand, where a series of testimonies had already been delivered. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that made people uneasy, shifting in their seats. But in the farthest row of the courtroom, a small figure sat still, a young girl, no older than 8 or 9. Her name was Zoe, and though she was small, her presence in the room was anything but inconspicuous. She sat next to her mother, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on the proceedings. She didn't seem nervous, nor did she appear to be intimidated by the weight of the situation. Instead, there was something in her gaze, a quiet intensity, as though she understood far more than her age would suggest. Max, her dog, lay at her feet, his head resting on the floor, eyes half closed, calm as ever. Most of the room paid no attention to the dog, as pets weren't typically allowed in courtrooms, but this wasn't just any ordinary case. Max wasn't just a dog, he was Zoe's constant companion, a protector and confidant, and he had been by her side through every hard moment of her life. The room was filled with people who were used to courtrooms, lawyers, clerks, even a few reporters, but they all seemed to be holding their breath. There was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something just out of reach. The trial had gone on for days, and yet no one seemed to know who was truly in the right. The case was complicated, involving accusations that seemed too impossible to believe and yet too real to ignore. As the lawyer for the defense presented his next argument, Zoe's eyes flicked to the side, toward Max. She leaned down slightly, so only he could see, and gave him a subtle nod. It was almost imperceptible to anyone watching, but Max's ears perked up instantly. He sat up straighter, his gaze shifting around the room with an alertness that could not be ignored. It was a simple, quiet signal, but in that moment, it was clear that Zoe was communicating with him in a way that only they understood. The judge, an elderly man with deep lines etched into his face, paused mid-sentence. His gavel was poised in the air, but something had caught his attention. His sharp gaze flickered to Zoe, and then to Max. The tension in the room seemed to increase tenfold as everyone waited, wondering what had just happened. "Is there something wrong, miss?" the judge finally asked, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of confusion. Zoe's mother, who had been sitting quietly beside her daughter, glanced nervously at Zoe. She could feel the sudden change in the room. Her hand instinctively moved to rest on Zoe's shoulder, a gesture of comfort, but Zoe did not move. She remained focused, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor," Zoe's mother began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's nothing wrong. Zoe, she's just a little nervous." The judge looked at Zoe, then at the dog. He was no stranger to unusual situations, but this was something entirely different. He had seen many children in his years on the bench, but none quite like Zoe. There was a calmness to her, a quiet certainty in the way she held herself, and yet there was something about this moment that seemed out of place. His eyes narrowed, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the strange interaction between the child and her dog. Before he could respond, Zoe slowly stood up from her seat, her small frame rising with surprising confidence. She looked directly at the judge, her voice steady and clear as she spoke, "Max knows what's going to happen next." The words hung in the air like a challenge, unexpected and strange, but undeniably compelling. The judge blinked, his brow furrowing, his thoughts momentarily derailed by the audacity of the statement. The room fell into complete silence. Zoe's mother glanced up at her daughter, confusion etched on her face. She had never heard Zoe speak with such certainty before. What was going on? Was she referring to the trial? Was this just some child's fantasy? The judge, still trying to process the situation, leaned forward. "What do you mean, miss? How could your dog know anything about this case?" Zoe's eyes didn't leave the judge as she answered. "Max knows everything," she said, her voice unwavering. "He's seen it all." The room seemed to freeze. Even the lawyers, who were accustomed to dramatic statements in court, were momentarily stunned into silence. Max, who had been resting quietly at Zoe's feet, now stood up, his ears alert, his eyes scanning the room. It was as if he understood what Zoe had just said, as if he had been waiting for this very moment to arrive. He took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes locked on the judge. His movements were deliberate, each step calculated, as though he had a purpose. The judge's expression shifted. For the briefest of moments, he seemed to soften, his eyes filled with something akin to disbelief. This wasn't how a typical courtroom drama unfolded. A child, a dog, and a cryptic statement, everything about this scene felt like it was straight out of a mystery novel, yet here it was, unfolding in real life. "Your Honor," the defense attorney interrupted, clearly uneasy with the growing tension. "I believe this is irrelevant to the case at hand. We're here to discuss the facts, not." But the judge held up a hand, silencing the lawyer. His gaze remained fixed on Zoe and Max, his mind clearly grappling with the situation. He could sense there was more to this story than met the eye. There was something significant about the way Zoe had spoken, something that hinted at a truth that no one could yet see. "I'll allow it," the judge finally said, his voice measured but firm. "But I will remind everyone here that this courtroom is a place for facts, not," he paused, glancing at Zoe one more time, "speculation." Zoe nodded, her face calm, as if she had known all along that this moment would come. Max remained at her side, his eyes still trained on the judge, unwavering. The courtroom was silent for a long moment, the air thick with anticipation. What would happen next? What exactly had Zoe meant by her words? The uncertainty, the curiosity, it was overwhelming. Everyone in the room felt it, the quiet, unspoken question hanging in the air. As the judge sat back in his chair, still processing, the courtroom buzzed with a renewed energy. No one knew what Zoe's signal to Max meant, but one thing was certain, this case was about to take a turn none of them could have predicted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Zoe had always been quiet, not in a shy way, but in a way that suggested she was processing everything around her, everything her eyes saw, everything her ears heard. Some people thought she was just a reserved child, but her mother knew better. Zoe was always paying attention, always understanding more than she let on. And that made her special. But it also made her different. The courtroom was one place where Zoe's unusual sense of perception was both an asset and a burden. She had already heard enough in the last few days to know that this trial wasn't just about what was right or wrong. There was something else happening here, something much deeper, and Zoe was determined to get to the bottom of it. As she sat next to her mother, the weight of everything that had brought them to this point rested heavily on her tiny shoulders. Her mother, Carla, had been through so much in her life. She was a strong woman, determined to provide for Zoe despite all the challenges they faced, but that didn't mean she could protect her daughter from the things happening around them. Carla had fought her whole life for Zoe's future, for her safety, and for the kind of life Zoe deserved. But now, with the trial in full swing, it seemed like their lives were hanging by a thread. Zoe could feel the tension in the room, but she also knew that this was bigger than just her mother's case. There were bigger forces at play, forces that had been moving in the background long before this trial began. And Max, her ever-loyal dog, was the key to understanding it all. Max had been with Zoe since she was a baby, and there was no one she trusted more. Zoe's bond with Max was unbreakable, a quiet understanding between them that no one else could fathom. Max wasn't just a dog to Zoe, he was her protector, her confidant, her friend. And sometimes, Zoe could swear that he understood her better than anyone else. Max wasn't the typical dog. He was calm, intuitive, and had a sense of loyalty that went beyond the ordinary. He had a special ability to sense when something was wrong, when danger was near. And whenever Zoe felt scared or uncertain, Max would always be there, offering her comfort without a word. Zoe had learned to trust him in ways she hadn't even trusted herself. As Zoe sat in the courtroom, watching the proceedings unfold, she couldn't help but think about the past, the things she had seen, the things she had felt. Her mind wandered to the first time she had noticed Max's strange behavior. It was a few years ago, during one of the hardest times of her life. It had started with a phone call, a late-night call that Carla had received in a panic. Zoe had been asleep in her bed when she heard her mother's voice rise in alarm, followed by the hurried sound of footsteps. She had gotten up to find her mother on the phone, her face pale and strained. Carla tried to hide the worry in her voice, but Zoe could tell something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Zoe had crept into the living room, her small feet silent on the floor, and watched her mother from the shadows. She couldn't hear all the details of the conversation, but she understood enough to know that the call was about the trial. About a case her mother was involved in, a case that could ruin everything. Zoe had been too young to fully grasp the significance of it at the time, but she remembered the way her mother's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. Carla had spent the next few days in a state of constant worry, her mind preoccupied with something that seemed out of her control. Zoe could feel the strain in the air, and that's when Max had started acting strangely. Max had always been protective of Zoe, but during that time, he seemed to sense her mother's anxiety. He would sit by the door for hours, his eyes fixed on the hallway, as though waiting for something. And then, one night, something had happened that made Zoe realize just how deeply connected Max was to the things happening around them. Zoe had woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of growling. It was a deep, low sound, an unsettling sound that sent a chill down her spine. She had rushed out of her room, heart pounding, and found Max standing by the door to the living room, his teeth bared, eyes wide and alert. "Max?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Max didn't move. His eyes locked onto the door, his growls growing louder. Zoe felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She had never seen Max like this before. It was as though he was trying to protect her from something she couldn't see. That was the moment Zoe understood. Max wasn't just a dog. He was something more. He could sense danger, even when it wasn't visible to anyone else. The following weeks had been filled with a series of strange occurrences. Zoe's mother became increasingly distant and preoccupied, and Max's behavior grew more intense. He started following Zoe everywhere, even into the bathroom, his eyes never leaving her. Zoe could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her mother, but she couldn't figure out what was happening. Max, though, seemed to know. He would bark at strange hours of the night, as if warning them about something just beyond the horizon. One day, as Zoe was playing in the backyard, Max had suddenly run to the edge of the fence, growling furiously at something that was out of sight. Zoe had called to him, but he didn't respond. When she finally reached him, she saw nothing but the empty street beyond the fence. There was no one there. But Max didn't stop growling. He was fixated on something Zoe couldn't see. "Max, what is it?" Zoe had whispered, but Max only continued to stare into the distance, unblinking. She felt a chill run through her as she realized that whatever it was something Max could sense but she couldn't. It was then that Zoe understood that the trial her mother was involved in wasn't just about what was happening now, it was connected to something far older. Something that had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that the same forces were at work once again. Max had reacted to something in the courtroom, something no one else had noticed. But Zoe knew that whatever it wasn't good. Her fingers tightened around Max's collar, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep, unshakable sense of urgency. Something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The courtroom felt oppressive, a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. The air was thick with anticipation, and each person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to break. As Zoe sat quietly, her fingers still wrapped around Max's collar, she could feel the tension building within her. It was the same feeling she had gotten before a storm, when the sky seemed too still, too silent, and everything around her was on the verge of exploding. Max remained calm, though, his body still, his head held high, as though he had an understanding that no one else did. His gaze flickered to the judge once more, and Zoe instinctively knew that whatever was coming next, Max would be ready. The judge had returned to his seat, clearly unsettled by the strange exchange between Zoe and her dog. His eyes lingered on Zoe for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly on his desk as though he was pondering something deeply. Finally, he spoke, his voice stern but measured. "Miss Zoe," the judge began, his gaze sharp, "I understand that you feel your dog knows something, but I must remind you that this is a court of law. We deal with facts, not speculative statements. If your dog has any relevant information, I suggest you speak plainly." Zoe felt a pang of unease. It wasn't that she didn't want to explain herself, she simply didn't have the words to describe what Max could sense. How could she explain the strange connection between them, the bond that allowed Max to feel things no one else could? How could she make them understand that Max wasn't just a dog, but something more? Zoe glanced at her mother, who was sitting beside her, her face pale with worry. Carla had been quiet throughout the trial, her eyes darting nervously between Zoe and the proceedings. She was a strong woman, but she could feel the pressure mounting. Her nerves were stretched thin. Zoe could see it in the way her mother held herself, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of her jacket. "Your Honor, if I may," Zoe's mother interjected, her voice trembling with anxiety, "Zoe, she's had some unusual experiences." Carla hesitated, glancing at Zoe as if searching for the right words. "We've been through a lot, and sometimes, she and Max seem to have this connection, this understanding. It's hard to explain, but it's real." The judge's brow furrowed at Carla's words. He was a seasoned professional, a man who had presided over countless trials, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. A child speaking cryptically about her dog sensing something in the courtroom? The idea seemed absurd, yet something about Zoe's calm demeanor made him pause. "Miss Carla," the judge said slowly, his voice softening just a fraction, "I understand that you're trying to explain something that might seem difficult to grasp. But in this courtroom, we need concrete evidence, not emotional testimony." Zoe's stomach twisted into knots as she listened to the judge's words. She wanted to explain, to make him see what she had felt, but how could she? The truth was, she didn't know what Max knew, she only knew that he sensed things that were hidden from everyone else. And if what she feared was true, they were all on the brink of discovering something far darker than anyone had imagined. "Can we move on, Your Honor?" the defense attorney said, clearly eager to steer the focus back to the matter at hand. "This is all irrelevant to the case we are presenting." But the judge held up a hand, silencing the attorney with a single gesture. He wasn't ready to let go of this strange moment just yet. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Zoe and Max. "I will allow a short recess," the judge declared. "But I expect this to be resolved quickly. We are here to address the facts of the case, not indulge in speculation." The room buzzed with nervous energy as the judge called for a short break. The attorneys exchanged quiet words with their clients, and the bailiff began to usher people out of the courtroom. Zoe and her mother stood slowly, and Max rose to his feet as well, his eyes still fixed on the judge. As they made their way to the hallway, Zoe could feel the weight of the room's gaze following them. People were talking, whispering behind them, speculating about what had just happened. Carla kept her hand firmly on Zoe's shoulder, guiding her through the crowd. "Zoe, what are you doing?" Carla asked in a low voice. "You've got to stop this. They're not going to believe us if you keep talking like that. We're in enough trouble as it is." Zoe looked up at her mother, her dark eyes full of quiet understanding. She knew her mother was scared, scared for herself, scared for Zoe, scared for what this trial might mean for their future. But Zoe also knew that something bigger was at play. Max had never acted like this before. He had never responded to a situation with this kind of urgency. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that they were on the edge of discovering something that would change everything. "Mom," Zoe said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "Max knows something about this trial. He's trying to protect us." Carla glanced down at Zoe, her face tightening with concern. "I don't know what you mean, Zoe. I don't know what this is all about, but we have to be careful. If you keep bringing attention to yourself, it's going to make things worse." Zoe shook her head, her small face set in determination. "I can't just sit here and let them make things worse, Mom. We have to trust Max. He's been trying to tell us something for a long time." Carla didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply stared at Zoe, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Zoe had always been a bright child, far more perceptive than most. But this? This was something else entirely. It felt like Zoe was slipping into a world that Carla couldn't follow, a world where her daughter knew things that no one else could understand. "Let's just wait until the break is over," Carla finally said, her voice tight. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" Zoe nodded, but the unease in her chest didn't subside. She had a sinking feeling that this trial wasn't about to end the way anyone expected. There was something dark hidden behind all the lies and half-truths. And Max knew what it was. The courthouse hallway felt like a maze. The high ceilings and polished floors echoed with the shuffle of footsteps, the murmur of conversations, and the clinking of briefcases being set down. Zoe felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm. She had no idea how things would unfold next, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever happened, it wouldn't be the way anyone expected. Max, who had been unusually still during the break, now sat at Zoe's feet, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the tension in the air. His ears flicked occasionally, and his eyes never left the door to the courtroom, as though he sensed the next move before anyone else did. Carla, however, couldn't hide her growing anxiety. She was pacing now, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors, her hands clenched into fists. Every now and then, she would glance down at Zoe, trying to gauge how her daughter was handling the situation. Zoe, for her part, seemed unnervingly calm, but Carla had seen that look before. It was the look Zoe got when something wasn't right, when she knew things were about to take a turn, but didn't quite know how or why. "Zoe, you have to stop this," Carla said again, her voice strained. "You're making things harder for yourself." Zoe shook her head, her small face firm. "Mom, it's not about me. It's about you. It's about what's happening here. This trial, it's all wrong. Max and we're just trying to stop something bad from happening." Carla stopped pacing and knelt down in front of Zoe. "I don't know what you think you know, Zoe, but I'm telling you, you have to be careful. If you keep bringing attention to yourself, they'll start looking at us differently. We need to stay focused on what's important here, your testimony and what you saw." "I know," Zoe replied quietly, glancing down at Max, who nuzzled her hand reassuringly. "But sometimes the truth isn't just what we saw. It's something more." Carla opened her mouth to say something, but was interrupted by the sudden buzz of the courtroom door opening. A bailiff appeared, his expression unreadable. "All rise," he called, and the soft shuffle of feet echoed through the hallway as everyone prepared to return to the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with tension as they filed back into the room, Zoe walking beside her mother, Max still at her side. Zoe's eyes quickly scanned the room, noting the cold faces of the lawyers, the hushed whispers of spectators, and the determined posture of the judge. But something was different now. There was an unease in the air, an undercurrent that ran deeper than the surface-level discomfort from earlier. When they sat back down, Zoe felt Max shift slightly beside her, as though he, too, was anticipating something. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "We will now resume," the judge announced, his voice stern. "Miss Carla, you were about to testify. Please continue." Carla cleared her throat and nodded, trying to regain some composure. She stood up, her gaze meeting Zoe's for a fleeting moment, before turning back to face the courtroom. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her mother speak, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But even as Carla spoke, Zoe could feel the presence of something, or someone, lurking just beyond the surface. It was the same sensation she had felt earlier in the hallway, a feeling that something was just out of sight, something that had yet to reveal itself. Zoe didn't know why, but she felt it in her bones. The trial was about to take a drastic turn. The room seemed to hold its breath as Carla continued her testimony. Her voice had the smooth, practiced tone of someone who had been in a courtroom before, but Zoe could tell she was holding back, suppressing something deep within her. Carla had been through a lot in her life, and Zoe knew she was trying to protect her, trying to shield her from the worst of it. But Zoe wasn't a child anymore. She understood more than her mother thought. As the defense attorney rose to cross-examine, Zoe's attention snapped back to the present. The man was tall, with slick back hair and a sharp suit, his demeanor cold and calculating. His eyes locked onto Zoe, and for a moment, she felt the weight of his gaze, as if he were trying to gauge her every thought. "You've mentioned several times that you and your daughter are close," the defense attorney began, his voice smooth and condescending. "Could you elaborate on what exactly that means in the context of this trial? Are we to believe that the bond between you and your child has somehow influenced the facts you've presented here today?" Zoe stiffened. She knew where this was going. Carla hesitated, and Zoe could feel the panic rising in her mother's chest. The defense was trying to undermine her credibility, trying to turn the focus onto something they could use to discredit her. Zoe clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let this happen. She wasn't going to let her mother fall apart because of this. "Objection!" Zoe blurted, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. The entire courtroom went silent. Eyes turned to Zoe, surprise and confusion written on their faces. Carla's face blanched, and she shot Zoe a look of disbelief. The judge's eyes narrowed, and the defense attorney raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Your Honor," Zoe continued, her voice trembling but determined, "I know what you're trying to do. But my mom, she's not the one who's wrong here. You're not seeing what's really going on." The judge's gavel cracked again, silencing the room. "Miss Zoe," he said, his tone hard, "this is not a place for childish outbursts. If you have something important to say, you will wait for your turn." Zoe's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to back down. Max stood, his body tense beside her, and Zoe felt a strange surge of confidence. The courtroom was watching, waiting for her next move. It was now or never. "Max knows something," Zoe said, her voice rising above the silence. "He's been trying to tell us all along. He's not just a dog. He knows things. He can feel things." The murmurs in the room grew louder, and the defense attorney scoffed, clearly incredulous. "Are you seriously suggesting, Miss Zoe, that a dog is somehow involved in this trial? This is absurd." But Zoe didn't back down. She turned to the judge, her eyes wide with sincerity. "You have to listen to him. He's trying to protect us. He knows what's happening." The room seemed to buzz with uncertainty. Zoe's mother, now visibly distressed, rose to her feet, but Zoe held up a hand to stop her. She wasn't done yet. She couldn't stop now. And then, just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, Max barked, loud, sharp, and unrelenting. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto the defense attorney, who stood frozen, a look of shock on his face. In that moment, everything changed. The bark echoed through the courtroom, sharp and clear, vibrating in the walls, rattling everyone in its path. Zoe's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected Max to react so forcefully, and certainly not in front of so many people. But the moment his bark broke through the silence, something inside her shifted. It was as though he had punctured the veil of uncertainty, revealing something deeper, something that no one could deny. The defense attorney recoiled, his hands instinctively raising as if to shield himself from the sudden eruption. His confident, sarcastic demeanor faltered, his eyes wide in surprise. The judge, too, looked caught off guard. He leaned forward, staring at Max as if trying to decipher the meaning behind the dog's actions. For a moment, the entire room was frozen in place. Zoe sat there, stunned by the wave of intensity that had suddenly consumed the courtroom. She could feel the pounding of her heart in her chest, but the rush of adrenaline sharpened her senses. Max was doing something. Something that no one else understood, except her. "Order," the judge barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I will not tolerate disruptions in this courtroom. This is your final warning." But the judge's words were almost drowned out by the murmur of shock rippling through the room. Zoe turned to look at her mother, who stood with her mouth open, her eyes wide in disbelief. Carla's hands trembled at her sides, and for the first time, Zoe saw the fear in her mother's eyes, not just for herself, but for Zoe as well. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and Zoe knew that whatever was coming next would determine everything. Max was still standing, his body taut with tension, his ears pinned back as he stared at the defense attorney. His growl was low now, almost imperceptible, but it vibrated with an undeniable force, like a storm waiting to break. "Max, it's okay," Zoe whispered, but the dog didn't budge. He kept his gaze fixed, unwavering, his instincts telling him that something was wrong, something was out of place. Zoe couldn't explain it. She couldn't put words to the pull she felt in her chest, the unspoken bond between her and Max that made her certain he knew something no one else did. Something about the defense attorney, something about this trial, it was all connected, and Max had sensed it before anyone else. The judge was clearly struggling to maintain control. He called for the bailiff to come forward, but even the bailiff hesitated, his eyes darting from Max to Zoe with caution. "Get the dog under control," the judge demanded. "Now." Zoe stood up slowly, her body moving almost on instinct. She knelt down beside Max, placing a gentle hand on his collar. Max's growl softened, but he didn't stop staring at the defense attorney. His entire being radiated a sense of urgency. Zoe could feel the heat of his body beneath her fingertips, and the bond they shared seemed to pulse between them in that moment. Max knew something. Something important. "Please, Max," Zoe said softly, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "You have to let them see." Her words were meant to comfort him, but Zoe knew deep down that this was bigger than any of them. She didn't know what Max had sensed, but she could feel it, too, the weight of something looming just out of sight. The defense attorney cleared his throat and straightened, clearly regaining some of his composure. He was trying to mask his discomfort, but the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cold, "if this is how we are going to conduct this trial, I request that we suspend proceedings until the defendant's emotional outbursts can be properly addressed. This is ridiculous." The judge didn't immediately respond. Instead, he kept his gaze on Zoe, his mind clearly working through the strange situation unfolding in front of him. He could see the young girl kneeling beside her dog, her brow furrowed with concentration, and her eyes. Her eyes were filled with something more than fear. It was determination. The judge cleared his throat. "We will take another recess. Miss Zoe, please bring your dog outside. I will speak to the attorneys privately." Zoe nodded but didn't move immediately. Her eyes were locked onto the judge, and for the first time, she felt as though she had someone, just one person, who was actually listening. The room was still filled with an uncomfortable hum of whispers, but Zoe wasn't paying attention. She was focused entirely on Max. Slowly, she stood and pulled Max's leash, leading him outside of the courtroom. Carla followed behind them, her steps hesitant, unsure of how to handle this new turn of events. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her back, the judgment that followed them as they left the room. Once they were outside, Zoe knelt down and ran her hands through Max's fur. He was still on edge, his body trembling slightly under her touch. Zoe didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't just going to be about her anymore. "Max," Zoe said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you know?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Max looked up at her. His eyes were filled with something deep, something beyond the surface. And in that moment, Zoe realized it. Max wasn't just reacting to the people in the courtroom. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was responding to something that was bigger than them both. There was something dark hidden beneath the surface of this trial, and Max could feel it. He had known it from the beginning. "Zoe," Carla's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see her mother standing there, worry written on her face. "What's going on? You need to tell me what's happening." Zoe looked at her mother, her heart pounding. She wanted to explain, to make her mother understand, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too big, too complicated for anyone to grasp. Zoe could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, and she knew that the storm was only just beginning. The door to the courtroom opened again, and the judge stepped out, his expression grim. He didn't say anything immediately, but his eyes flickered between Zoe, her mother, and Max, and Zoe could see the unease in his gaze. Something had shifted. Zoe swallowed hard, standing up with Max by her side. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, they were going to have to face whatever was coming together. The tension was only rising, and the real trial, one that no one had anticipated, was about to begin. The doors to the courtroom swung closed behind them, leaving Zoe, Carla, and Max standing in the quiet hallway. The air felt thick with tension, as though everything in that moment was suspended, waiting for something to shift. Zoe could still feel the sharpness of the judge's gaze when they had left, and even now, the silence felt too loud. Carla stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was watching Zoe with a mixture of concern and disbelief. It was clear that the events of the past hour had shaken her to the core. But Zoe didn't know how to explain the weight of what she was feeling. There were no words that could capture what had just happened, or what Max had sensed. Zoe turned to Max, who was still sitting obediently at her feet, his eyes calm yet watchful. He looked up at her with a steady gaze, as though he understood the turmoil running through her mind. He was more than just a dog. Zoe had always known that in her heart, but now, in this moment, she felt it more strongly than ever. "I don't know what just happened," Carla said, her voice breaking the silence. "I mean, I know you were trying to help, but—" "Zoe, what's going on? Why did you do that? You can't just speak like that in the middle of a trial, especially not about something like this. You've made things worse." Zoe felt a knot twist in her stomach. Her mother's voice was tight, her words edged with frustration and fear. But Zoe wasn't scared anymore. She had felt Max's urgency, his drive to protect them both, and that certainty had pushed away her own doubt. There was something more here, something hidden beneath the surface of the trial that neither of them had yet uncovered. She wasn't going to let fear control her now. "I had to do it," Zoe replied softly, her voice steady. "I know it seems crazy, but Max knows something. I can feel it. He was trying to tell us all along. He knew the danger was coming." Carla's brow furrowed as she tried to process what Zoe was saying. "Zoe, this isn't about a dog. This is about a court case. And you can't just jump in like that. You need to be careful." Zoe shook her head, her fingers nervously curling around the leather strap of Max's leash. She understood her mother's concern, she knew Carla was trying to protect her, to keep her safe from what was happening. But there was no going back now. Zoe had spoken up, and Max had made it clear that there was something wrong. It wasn't just a coincidence. "We don't have time to be careful, Mom," Zoe said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "Something is going to happen. I don't know what, but I can feel it. Max can feel it, too." Carla's expression softened as she looked down at Max, who sat perfectly still at Zoe's side, his eyes watching both of them with a strange knowing. Carla sighed deeply and rubbed her temples, as if trying to make sense of everything. She wasn't used to feeling so out of control, and she didn't know how to protect Zoe from something she couldn't even understand herself. "I just want you to be safe," Carla said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Zoe stepped closer to her mother, her resolve hardening. She could see how much her mother cared, how deeply Carla wanted to shield her from the harsh realities of the world. But there was no way to ignore what was happening. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The trial, the court, the secrets that Max had been sensing, it was all tangled up in something far bigger than any of them. "I know you do," Zoe said, her voice softening. "But this isn't just about the trial anymore. It's about what happens next. We can't just wait and hope everything works itself out. We have to find out what Max knows. We have to find out what's really going on." There was a long pause as Carla considered her daughter's words. Zoe could see the conflict on her mother's face. But slowly, Carla nodded, as though a small part of her had finally accepted what Zoe was saying. "You're right," Carla said, her voice tired. "I can't protect you from everything, Zoe. I never could." Zoe reached out and took her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. In that moment, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to lighten, if only for a brief second. Zoe knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't alone anymore. They were in this together. "Thanks, Mom," Zoe whispered. Before Carla could respond, the courthouse doors opened once again, and the bailiff stepped out, his eyes scanning the hallway. He gave a curt nod toward Zoe, signaling that the judge was ready for them to return. Carla inhaled sharply, her hand still in Zoe's. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, as if she were trying to steady herself for whatever would come next. Together, they walked back into the courtroom, the tension palpable in the air. Zoe's heart was still racing, but now, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The trial was no longer just about testimony, it was about something deeper. Something dangerous. But now, with her mother by her side and Max alert as ever, Zoe felt like they were ready to face whatever truth the courtroom was hiding. The judge was already seated, his stern gaze waiting for them to settle back into their positions. Zoe sat down quickly, keeping Max close to her, his leash still in her hand. Carla followed, her expression hardening as she prepared herself to continue her testimony. The defense attorney, who had previously been flustered by Max's behavior, was back at his table, scribbling something in his notebook. He shot a brief glance toward Zoe, then quickly looked away. Zoe couldn't read his expression, but she didn't trust him. There was something about the way he had reacted to Max that unsettled her. It wasn't just surprise, it was fear. And that made Zoe more determined than ever to uncover what he was hiding. "Proceed," the judge commanded, his voice calm but unyielding. Carla nodded, her face regaining its composure. She stood up and began speaking again, but Zoe's focus was elsewhere now. She wasn't listening to the details of the case, her mind was racing with questions, with possibilities. What had Max known all along? Why had he reacted the way he did? What had triggered that bark? And most importantly, who was behind the trial, and what were they hiding? Zoe glanced down at Max, who was still sitting perfectly still at her feet. His eyes never wavered from the defense attorney, his body tense, alert. It was clear now that Max was more than just a witness to the trial, he was a part of it. And the truth, Zoe was certain, lay with him. As the days wore on, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Zoe and her mother had no idea just how deep the conspiracy went, or how far they would have to go to uncover it. But one thing was for certain, they couldn't back down now. Max had spoken, and now, the world would hear him. The courtroom would never be the same. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Zoe and her mother settled back into their seats. Max remained by Zoe's side, his presence a constant source of reassurance and unease. Zoe's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart still pounding from the emotional high of what had just happened. Max had done something no one could ignore, and Zoe was beginning to realize that the truth they were searching for was much darker than she had ever imagined. The trial resumed with the defense attorney speaking, his voice steady but cold. Your Honor, as we continue, I would like to request that we proceed without further disruptions from the defendant's emotional support animal. The word stung, but Zoe refused to flinch. She had seen the subtle fear in the defense attorney's eyes when Max had growled earlier. Zoe wasn't imagining it, he was afraid of Max. And whatever he was afraid of, it had something to do with the case at hand. Judge Collins looked down at the defense attorney, his expression unreadable. Mr. Thompson, I will remind you that this is a courtroom, and disruptions will not be tolerated. If you have concerns, address them properly. Otherwise, we will proceed. Thompson shifted in his seat but said nothing more. Zoe noticed the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his hands clenched as if trying to keep himself under control. There was a sense of desperation in him, and it only deepened her suspicions. Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something big. Let's continue, the judge said, signaling the prosecution to proceed. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, stood up and approached the bench. Zoe had heard her name, Ms. Michaels, many times throughout the trial. She was articulate, focused, and always appeared in control. But Zoe could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes whenever she glanced in Zoe's direction. It was as if something about the girl with the dog unsettled her. Zoe's mind raced as Ms. Michaels began her next statement, presenting evidence and trying to bring the case closer to its conclusion. She spoke of documents, witnesses, and testimony, but none of it truly registered to Zoe. Her mind was occupied with the idea that Max had known something important all along, something none of them could have anticipated. As the trial went on, Zoe began to notice something peculiar. The defense seemed unusually focused on her, and on Max. Each time she caught the eye of Mr. Thompson, he quickly looked away, almost as if he were trying to avoid being seen. And with every passing moment, the knot in Zoe's stomach tightened. The day stretched on, and by the time the lunch recess was called, Zoe felt both mentally and physically drained. Carla gave her a tired smile, clearly trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for her sake. She wrapped an arm around Zoe's shoulders and led her toward the courthouse's side exit. Max, as always, walked beside Zoe, alert and watchful. You okay? Carla asked, her voice quieter than usual. Zoe glanced at her mother, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on her. I'm fine, but something's wrong, Mom. I can feel it. The way Thompson keeps looking at me. The way Max reacted in court. He knows something, I'm sure of it. And I don't think it's just about this case. It's bigger than that. Carla stopped walking, her gaze softening with concern. She turned to face Zoe, her hand gently squeezing Zoe's shoulder. I don't know what to think anymore, Zoe. I don't even know how to help you with this. It's not just the trial. There's something more going on, isn't there? Zoe nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the ground beneath her feet. She wished she could explain it all, everything she was feeling, everything Max had shown her, but words didn't seem enough. The truth, whatever it was wrapped in layers she couldn't yet understand. I think we need to go back to the hotel, Zoe said finally, lifting her head to meet her mother's eyes. We need to think this through. Something's going on here, Mom, and I need your help. Carla hesitated but then nodded, clearly exhausted but willing to support her daughter no matter what. They made their way to the parking garage in silence, the weight of the trial still hanging in the air between them. Zoe could feel Max's presence beside her, steady and loyal. He wasn't just her pet. He was her protector, her guide through the unknown. As they reached the car, Carla opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. Zoe climbed into the passenger side, and Max jumped into the back, his usual spot. Carla started the engine, and the car pulled out of the parking garage and onto the road. The hum of the engine was the only sound between them, but Zoe's mind was a whirlwind. As they drove, her thoughts kept circling back to the defense attorney. There was something in his demeanor that didn't sit right with her. She knew he had been caught off guard by Max's reaction in court, but what had Max sensed? Was it more than just a random outburst? Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that Max had been trying to communicate something to them, a warning, maybe. "Mom," Zoe said after a long silence, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Do you remember the night before we came here? When Max started acting strange?" Carla glanced at her, her brow furrowing. "Yes. You told me he kept pacing and acting like he was on edge, but we didn't think much of it at the time." "Why?" Zoe paused, thinking carefully about how to phrase it. What if that wasn't just him being anxious about the trip? What if he knew something was going to happen here? What if he's been trying to warn us? Carla didn't respond immediately, and Zoe could tell she was processing the possibility. After a moment, her mother's voice broke the silence. "You might be onto something, Zoe," Carla said softly. "But what could it be? What does he know?" Zoe shook her head. "I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." They drove in silence for a while longer, but Zoe felt a sense of determination growing within her. There were pieces to this puzzle. Max had already given her a glimpse of what was to come. Now, it was up to her to dig deeper and uncover the truth. By the time they reached the hotel, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. Zoe's heart was racing, her thoughts still swirling with questions and uncertainties. But one thing was clear, the trial was only the beginning. Something darker was unfolding beneath the surface, and Zoe was going to have to face it head-on. As they walked into the hotel lobby, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one there. Still, the sensation lingered, and she couldn't help but wonder, who else knew what was really happening? And who was willing to do anything to keep it hidden? The hotel room was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioner. Zoe sat by the window, staring out at the city skyline, her mind churning with questions that wouldn't let her rest. She had tried to distract herself for hours with the usual things, checking her phone, texting her friends, but nothing could shake the gnawing feeling that there was something lurking just beneath the surface of the trial. Max had sensed it. He had reacted to it in the courtroom, and now, it was up to Zoe to piece together the puzzle before it was too late. Carla had retreated to her own thoughts, pacing back and forth in the room, her hands wringing in anxiety. She didn't fully understand everything Zoe was trying to explain, but she trusted her daughter. She could see it in Zoe's eyes, she was certain that something was wrong, something bigger than the case they were all caught up in. And that trust, however fragile, was all Zoe needed to keep pushing forward. "Mom," Zoe said, breaking the silence. "I think we need to go to the courthouse again tomorrow. We need to find out more about the defense attorney, Thompson. Something about him is off. And it's not just the way he reacted to Max." Carla stopped pacing and looked at her. "Thompson? The defense attorney?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? You're thinking he's involved in something?" Zoe nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I don't know yet, but I have this feeling that he's hiding something. The way he looked at Max, like he was terrified of him. And the way he tried to downplay Max's presence in court, it wasn't just about the dog. He's hiding something, and I think it has to do with this case. With everything." Carla crossed the room and sat down beside Zoe, her voice quiet but serious. "Zoe, I don't want to see you get hurt by getting too involved in this. We came here for the trial, but if you're right, if there's something more to this than we know, it's dangerous. We could be getting in over our heads." Zoe turned to face her mother, her heart pounding. "I know, Mom. But I can't sit here and do nothing. I know Max is trying to tell me something. He's always been so in tune with everything around him. He's been more alert these last few days than ever before. He's not just a pet. He's trying to protect us." Carla sighed, her shoulders sagging as she leaned back against the bedpost. "Okay. But you need to be careful. I can't lose you, Zoe." Zoe reached over and squeezed her mother's hand, her resolve firm. "I won't let anything happen to us. I promise." The night dragged on, with both mother and daughter unable to sleep, each consumed by their own thoughts. Zoe tried to rest, but every time she closed her eyes, images of the courtroom and the mysterious behavior of the defense attorney kept flooding her mind. She could still see his clenched jaw, the way his eyes darted nervously when he caught sight of Max. There was something in the way he had reacted that didn't sit right with her. Max, sensing the unease in the room, padded over to Zoe and lay down next to her, his warm presence offering comfort. He let out a soft sigh, his body curled protectively at her feet. Zoe reached down and stroked his fur, her fingers brushing over the familiar texture that had always brought her peace. But now, even his presence couldn't quell the rising anxiety inside her. At last, the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn creeping through the curtains. Zoe sat up, her mind made up. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to find out what Thompson was hiding, and she had to do it before the trial resumed. "Mom, wake up," Zoe said, gently shaking her mother's arm. "We're going to the courthouse." Carla groggily opened her eyes, blinking at the daylight streaming through the window. She yawned, but the concern was still evident in her expression. "You sure about this, Zoe?" Zoe stood up, her eyes full of determination. "I have to be. We're not leaving until we find out everything." After a quick breakfast, the pair left the hotel room, their movements quick and purposeful. Zoe's heart was beating faster now, a mix of excitement and fear filling her chest. She knew they were venturing into dangerous territory, but the sense of urgency, of something unknown threatening to unravel, was enough to drive her forward. When they arrived at the courthouse, it was still early, and the building was relatively quiet. Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them as they entered the courthouse lobby. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she instinctively pulled Max's leash tighter, his body now walking slightly ahead of her, as if he too sensed the unease in the air. They made their way to the courtroom where the trial had been held, but before they could step inside, Zoe noticed a familiar figure in the hallway, a janitor, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. He looked up as they approached and gave them a faint, nervous smile. "Can I help you?" the janitor asked in a low voice, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. Zoe stepped forward, her curiosity piqued. "We're looking for information about the trial. About the defense attorney, Mr. Thompson. Do you know anything about him?" The janitor's eyes darted to the side before he leaned in closer. "I don't know much, but I've been cleaning the courtrooms for years. And I've seen him before. Real weird guy, that Thompson. Always on edge, like he's hiding something. You'd be surprised what you can hear when you're sweeping the floors." Zoe's pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" The janitor hesitated, his eyes scanning the hallway again. "I heard him talking with someone. Late one night, just after the trial started. He was worried. Not just about the case, but about someone who was pressuring him. He was scared, and he mentioned something about keeping a secret. He said, 'I don't care what it takes, I won't let anyone know the truth.'" Zoe felt a chill run down her spine. "Who was he talking to?" The janitor shook his head. "I don't know. He was careful. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. All I know is, Thompson's hiding something. And whatever it is, it's big." Zoe's mind raced as she processed what the janitor had just revealed. Thompson wasn't just an attorney trying to win a case, he was being manipulated, pressured by someone. And the secret he was keeping had to be connected to the case. But how? What was it? Before Zoe could ask any more questions, Carla stepped forward, placing a hand on Zoe's arm. "Let's go, Zoe. We need to get back to the hotel." Zoe glanced at her mother, but her mind was already reeling with the new information. She wasn't sure what this new revelation meant, but one thing was certain: Thompson was involved in something far darker than they had ever imagined. "Okay," Zoe said, her voice tight with determination. "But we're not done yet. I'm going to find out who's behind this, and I won't stop until I do." Max, walking beside her, seemed to nod in agreement, as though he, too, understood the gravity of what was coming next. Zoe could feel the weight of the janitor's words pressing down on her as she and Carla made their way back to the hotel. The vague but disturbing image of Thompson whispering in the dark, worried about someone pressuring him, kept replaying in her mind. Someone was controlling him, manipulating the situation, and Zoe had to figure out who, before they figured out how to stop her. Once they were back in the hotel room, Zoe wasted no time in sitting down at the small desk by the window. She pulled out her phone, starting to scroll through everything she could find on Thompson, his background, his previous cases, anything that could give her some insight into who he was beyond the courtroom. But nothing came up that felt like it could help. All the basic public information said the same thing: Thompson was a successful but somewhat under-the-radar defense attorney with a few notable wins. Not exactly the sinister figure she was hoping to find. Max, as if sensing her frustration, padded over and sat by her feet. Zoe reached down to scratch his ears absent-mindedly, letting his presence calm her slightly. But it wasn't enough to stop her mind from racing. She felt like she was chasing shadows, looking for something that wasn't there, or something that didn't want to be found. "Mom," Zoe said, breaking the silence, "I don't know what else to look for. I'm getting nowhere with this research." Carla was sitting across from her on the bed, arms crossed, looking as tense as Zoe felt. She had been quiet for a long time, and Zoe could tell that her mother was struggling with the fear and uncertainty surrounding them. "I don't know what to tell you," Carla said, her voice soft. "You're right, something isn't adding up. But we can't go barging into the trial without some kind of proof. We need more. If Thompson really is hiding something, we need to find out what it is, and what's at stake for him." Zoe nodded, biting her lip. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. She could feel herself becoming consumed by it, by the idea that whatever was happening, it was bigger than just a trial. It was about secrets. Lies. And maybe even the very people who were supposed to protect her and her family. Max seemed to sense her rising anxiety. He nudged her hand with his nose, and she looked down into his deep, knowing eyes. Zoe smiled softly, a small sense of calm washing over her. "You're right, Max. We'll figure this out." Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Both Zoe and Carla froze, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Zoe felt her heartbeat quicken, wondering who it could be. It was still early afternoon, too early for anyone to be dropping by the hotel, especially anyone from the trial. Carla stood first, her face etched with concern. "Should I answer it?" Zoe nodded. "Be careful, Mom. I don't trust anything right now." With a tense breath, Carla crossed the room and opened the door. Standing there was a man Zoe hadn't seen before. He was in his mid-40s, with dark hair and sharp eyes. He wasn't dressed in a suit like most people involved in the trial. Instead, he wore casual clothes, though there was something about him that immediately put Zoe on edge. It wasn't just the fact that he was at their door, he looked like someone who knew more than he was letting on. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice low but urgent. "Is Zoe Morrison here?" Zoe's stomach dropped. There was something familiar about the way he spoke, something she couldn't place. Carla glanced at Zoe, her expression guarded but neutral. "She's here," Carla said cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes shifted toward Zoe, and for a split second, he studied her, sizing her up. Then, without another word, he stepped past Carla into the room. Zoe instinctively stood up, her body tense. She glanced at her mother, but Carla was already taking a step back, clearly unsure of how to react. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man said quickly, sensing the unease in the room. But I think you need to hear what I have to say, Zoe. It's important. Zoe crossed her arms, watching him closely. Who are you? And why are you here? The man hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice dropping even lower. My name is John Cole. I used to work with Thompson. And I know he's hiding something much bigger than you think. Zoe felt the tension in her chest rise again. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? And why should I believe you? John took a deep breath, his gaze darting briefly toward the door, then back to Zoe. Because I was there. I know what's going on. Thompson isn't just defending someone in this case. He's working for someone much more powerful than you realize. And they're not just threatening him, they're threatening you, too. Carla stepped in at that moment, her voice sharp. What do you mean? Who's threatening my daughter? Who's involved? John looked around the room, as if making sure no one was listening in. He lowered his voice. There are people in high places, people who have been watching you, Zoe. Watching your family. The reason the case is dragging on and getting so complicated, it's all connected. There's something in your past, something your father was involved in, and Thompson's been caught in the middle. But they won't stop until they get what they want. Zoe's heart was pounding in her chest. She had so many questions, but no answers. The idea that her father was somehow involved in all of this was like a punch to the gut. He had always been a mystery to her, someone she barely knew. But now, this revelation made her feel like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Why should we trust you? Carla asked, her voice quivering with suspicion. You say you worked with Thompson, but why are you here, telling us this now? John hesitated for a moment, looking down at his shoes before meeting Zoe's gaze again. Because Thompson is in over his head, and he's scared. Scared of what will happen if you keep pressing for the truth. I'm trying to stop this before it gets any worse. They don't want you to find out what really happened. Not yet. But you have to be careful. Someone's watching. Zoe felt a wave of confusion and dread wash over her. Who were they? What did they want from her? And most importantly, what was the secret her father had been keeping all these years? Before she could ask any more questions, John turned abruptly, heading for the door. I'm sorry. I wish I could explain everything, but I can't. Just know that you're not alone. There are people out there who want to help you, but you need to stay quiet. For now. Zoe stood frozen in the center of the room as he disappeared down the hallway. She felt the world spinning, everything suddenly making less sense than ever. Her mind was racing, a million thoughts flying at once, but one thing was certain, she was no longer in control of the situation. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about the trial. It was bigger. Much bigger. And now, she was caught right in the middle of it. The weight of John Cole's warning hung over Zoe long after the strange man had left their hotel room. What was his agenda? Was he a friend, or was he just another player in the game of deception? More importantly, what was the truth that he seemed so desperate to keep from her? It felt like the world around her was crumbling, piece by piece, as each new revelation brought more questions than answers. Zoe sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands through her hair in frustration. Her mother was pacing back and forth in the small hotel room, clearly agitated but trying to keep calm for Zoe's sake. Max sat by her feet, his large brown eyes fixed on Zoe, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Mom, Zoe said, breaking the silence. We need to figure out who they are. Who's threatening us? And what does all of this have to do with my father? Carla stopped pacing and sat down beside Zoe. Her expression was serious, almost grim. I don't know, honey. But I think it's time we take matters into our own hands. We can't wait for things to unravel any further. We need to understand what's really going on, and we need to get ahead of it before it catches up with us. Zoe nodded, feeling the same urgency. I agree. But how? We don't even know who's pulling the strings here. Carla stood up, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. The only place we know where this mess is happening is the courthouse. We've been skirting around it, but we need to dig deeper, much deeper. If Thompson's involved with someone dangerous, then the courthouse, the trial, and everything surrounding it could be the key to finding out who's behind all of this. Zoe stood up too, the words her mother spoke resonating with her. It made sense, even if it was dangerous. They had to go back. They had to find something, anything, that could give them more information about the shadowy forces pulling the strings. I'm ready, Zoe said, determination settling into her bones. We need to get to the heart of this. With that, they set out for the courthouse once again, their pace quickening as they moved down the street. Zoe could feel her pulse quicken with each step. Was she walking into a trap? Or was this the key to everything? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't stop. Max stayed close to her side, his presence grounding her in a way that calmed her nerves. He had always been her protector, but now, she needed to be the protector, of herself, her family, and the truth. The courthouse loomed ahead, an imposing building of stone and glass. It seemed even more foreboding now, as if it were hiding something beneath its cold exterior. Zoe hesitated for a moment, taking in the massive structure, before pushing the door open. The lobby was quiet as usual, and a few people milled about, not paying much attention to the newcomers. Zoe's eyes scanned the area, searching for anyone who might be watching them. There was an unsettling sense of being observed, like eyes were fixed on them from the shadows. Max, usually calm and collected, was alert, his ears perked as he moved closer to Zoe. Carla noticed it too, her hand tightening around Zoe's arm. This place feels wrong, Carla whispered, her voice tight with unease. Zoe nodded, her eyes still searching for any sign of danger. They approached the clerk's desk, where a young woman sat typing away, her face a mask of indifference. Excuse me, Zoe said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. We need to speak to someone who works here. Someone who might know about the trial involving the defendant, Thomas Ward. The clerk glanced up, giving them a polite but uninterested look. That trial's still in session. You'll have to come back later if you want to speak to someone. You can leave a message with me if you'd like. Zoe leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. No, we need to speak with someone who can tell us more about the defense attorney, specifically, Mr. Thompson. The clerk's eyes flickered for a moment before she gave a tight-lipped smile. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. But there is someone who might be able to. If you wait here for a moment, I'll get someone from security. Zoe exchanged a glance with her mother. This was a strange turn of events. Was she being led into something more dangerous, or was someone willing to help them? Whatever the answer was, Zoe wasn't about to back down now. Not after everything they'd already uncovered. Max let out a low growl, and Zoe instinctively placed a hand on his head, trying to soothe him. Whatever was happening, she could feel the tension building in the air. Something was coming, and it wouldn't be good. After what felt like an eternity, the woman returned with a tall, broad-shouldered man in a security uniform. He was older, his face weathered and serious. He looked at Zoe and Carla with a careful, almost calculating gaze. I understand you want to know about the defense attorney, Mr. Thompson, he said in a gravelly voice. I'm afraid that information isn't something we usually disclose to visitors. Zoe didn't hesitate. She pushed forward, her voice calm but firm. We know that Thompson is involved in something much bigger than just a courtroom. We know that he's being pressured, and we need to understand what's going on. Someone's life is at risk. Ours may already be. The man studied her for a long moment, then sighed. I can't say much. But there's one person who might be able to help you. He's someone from the court administration, and he's been around longer than most people realize. If you're serious about getting answers, you might want to speak to him. Zoe's heart raced. This was it. This was the break they had been waiting for. But she knew better than to trust anyone in this place too easily. She had learned that much the hard way. Where do we find him? Carla asked, her voice steady despite the tension. The man looked over his shoulder before leaning in, his voice barely above a whisper. Go to the old records room on the 4th floor. But be careful. Not everyone in this building can be trusted. Keep your wits about you. Zoe felt her pulse spike as the man stepped back, watching them closely. Thank you, she said, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. She grabbed Carla's arm, and together they started toward the elevator. Once inside, Zoe pressed the button for the 4th floor, and the doors slid closed with a soft chime. Her mind was racing. Was this a trap? Or had they just found the key to unraveling the entire mystery? There was no turning back now. The elevator doors opened, and the hallway on the 4th floor was dimly lit, almost eerily quiet. The air felt thick, charged with something Zoe couldn't put her finger on. Max's low growl beside her confirmed that he, too, sensed something was off. They found the door to the records room, old and weathered, as if it hadn't been used in years. The door creaked open as Zoe pushed it, revealing rows upon rows of dusty files stacked high on metal shelves. It was dark and cramped, the air stale with age and neglect. But in the back of the room, Zoe saw a figure standing near a desk, hunched over a stack of papers. It was a man, his face partially hidden by the shadows, but Zoe could make out the faint outline of a familiar silhouette. He looked up as they entered, his eyes cold and calculating. I've been expecting you, the man said, his voice low and unsettling. Let's talk about what you've stumbled into. The man standing at the back of the records room was a mystery in himself. As Zoe and Carla entered, the low hum of fluorescent lights above seemed to grow louder in the sudden silence. The figure barely moved, but Zoe could feel the weight of his gaze on them, like a shadow pressing down. She stepped forward, trying to steady her breathing, even as her pulse quickened. Max growled softly, sensing the tension, but Zoe whispered for him to stay calm. Her heart pounded in her chest, and despite her best efforts, the creeping sense of dread wouldn't leave her. Who are you? Zoe demanded, her voice firmer than she felt. The man was dressed in a simple, slightly worn suit, his hands clasped in front of him as if he were waiting for them to speak. His face was angular, with sharp eyes that held secrets of their own. There was something about him that seemed both tired and wary, like someone who had lived with heavy burdens for too long. My name is Robert Harding, he said slowly, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. I've been working here for over 20 years, dealing with the records that no one else wants to look at. And now, it seems I'm the only one who can help you. Zoe narrowed her eyes. Help us? What do you know about all of this? Her words felt thick with suspicion, but she had to know. She had to know if this was a chance at real answers, or another dead end. Harding sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to make sure they were alone. It's complicated, he said, his voice laced with a bitterness Zoe couldn't ignore. And it's dangerous. You need to understand that. The people involved in this case are not who they appear to be. Not by a long shot. Carla, who had been standing silently beside Zoe, finally spoke up. We know that much. But what exactly are you talking about? What's really going on here? Robert Harding's gaze flickered briefly to Carla before returning to Zoe. I'm not sure how much you've pieced together, but you're right to be asking questions. Thompson, the defense attorney, is being controlled by forces far beyond his control. But he's not the only one. You mentioned your father earlier, didn't you? Zoe's heart skipped. The mention of her father, even in this cold, dim room, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. What did Harding know about her father? Was this more of the same cryptic warning, or was there more to the story? My father? Zoe asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her throat had tightened. Harding's eyes softened, though only slightly. Yes, your father. The connection runs deeper than you know. Your father was involved in a case many years ago, one that no one talks about anymore. Not openly, at least. It was supposed to be buried. But now it's resurfacing, and it's dragging everyone back into the chaos. Zoe took a step forward, her mind racing. What case? What did he do? Harding hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just a case, Zoe. Your father was part of something much larger, a network of people who used the legal system for their own gain. There were deals made in the dark, compromises that shouldn't have happened. Your father's role was pivotal, he was the key to unlocking a much darker web. Zoe's stomach churned, the words sinking into her like stones. Are you saying my father was involved in illegal activities? A conspiracy? Harding nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Yes. And the case you're involved in now, the one with Thompson, is directly tied to the things your father did. It's not just about the courtroom. It's about power, money, and the dangerous people who control it all. A cold wave washed over Zoe. All this time, she had thought her father's life was a mystery because of the distance he had put between them, because of the secrets he kept. But now, she understood that the true mystery was something far darker than she could ever have imagined. Her father had been part of a web of corruption, of illegal dealings that had far-reaching consequences, and now she, by extension, was caught in the middle of it. How do you know all of this? Carla asked, her voice rising slightly with concern. What makes you so sure? Harding glanced around once more, his eyes narrowing as though making sure no one was eavesdropping. I was there. I was part of it. I'm not proud of what I did. I never thought it would come to this, but now. He shook his head, the regret and guilt written all over his face. I was a clerk back in those days. I handled the paperwork, the records, the things that weren't supposed to be seen. But it all came crashing down. Your father was a man of influence, and he used that influence in ways that would make your skin crawl. Zoe felt a strange numbness take over her body. Her father, the man she had always tried to understand, had been a part of something so twisted, so much bigger than she could have imagined. The revelations were coming so fast, she couldn't keep up. But there was one thing she knew for sure, her father's past was coming back to haunt them, and no matter how much she wished she could avoid it, she couldn't escape. But why are you telling us this now? Zoe asked, trying to steady her emotions. What do you want from us? Harding's expression grew even more somber, as though he knew that what he was about to say would be the final push in a series of dangerous events. Because they're coming for you, Zoe, Harding said, his voice low and urgent. The people who control everything, who controlled your father, are still here. They haven't forgotten him. And now, they haven't forgotten you. Carla looked at him, confusion and fear mixing in her eyes. What are you talking about? Who's coming for us? Harding's voice lowered even further. The people who were involved in those deals, the ones your father made with, are still in power. And they're involved in the trial you've been following. Thompson may have been coerced into working with them, but there are others you haven't met yet, who are much more dangerous. And they're all after the same thing, control. Zoe's mind spun as she tried to process the magnitude of what Harding was saying. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It wasn't just about her father. It was about a system of corruption so vast and entrenched that it spanned decades, and now, Zoe and Carla were in the crosshairs. What do we do? Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her thoughts raced as she felt the walls closing in around her. How do we stop this? Harding straightened, his eyes filled with both warning and resolve. You have to be careful. Don't trust anyone completely. And above all, be prepared for anything. The truth is a dangerous weapon. And once it's unleashed, it can't be put back. Zoe nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination surge within her. She didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear, the stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable height. As Harding turned to leave, his final words echoed in the quiet of the records room, "If you want to survive this, you have to play their game. But you have to play it smarter than they do." Zoe stood frozen in the room, her mind reeling with everything Harding had said. What was her next move? What was she about to walk into? But more than anything, she knew this, the truth was now more dangerous than ever. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Zoe stood in the shadows of the old records room, her mind reeling from the weight of Robert Harding's words. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the air heavy with the promise of danger. She barely noticed her hands trembling, a telltale sign of how deeply the conversation had affected her. Her heart pounded in her chest, not just from fear, but from the realization that everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and herself had just been turned upside down. Harding had warned her that the truth was a weapon, a dangerous one. And she understood now what he meant. If she and Carla were going to survive whatever storm was headed their way, they couldn't afford to trust anyone. Not even Robert Harding. His sudden willingness to help them didn't feel like charity, it felt like a calculated risk on his part. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust him, but she didn't have time to be cautious. "Mom," Zoe whispered, turning to Carla, who was standing just inside the doorway, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "What do we do now?" Carla didn't answer immediately. She was looking at Zoe, her eyes flicking between the darkened hallway outside and the mysterious man who had just walked away. Then, finally, she shook her head, her voice tight. "We keep moving forward, Zoe. Whatever's happening here, we can't back down now. We've already come too far." Zoe nodded, taking a deep breath as she turned back to look at the rows of dusty records lining the room. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Her entire world had been pulled from beneath her feet in the span of a few hours, and she had no idea where it would land next. "Let's find out what we can," Zoe said, her voice firm despite the doubts that threatened to creep in. "Harding may have given us a lead, but we need more. We need to know who's behind all of this, who's really pulling the strings." Carla stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Zoe's shoulder. "Let's be careful. We don't know what we're up against. And we don't know who we can trust." Zoe gave her mother a small nod, appreciating the caution. But there was no time to waste. They had to act fast if they were going to prevent any more lives from being destroyed. The records room was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the distant hum of the building's old air conditioning system. Zoe scanned the shelves, her mind working through the possibilities. Harding had mentioned that her father's involvement in the case was just the tip of the iceberg, but what did that mean? Who was involved, and what were they after? She needed to know more about the people who were pulling the strings, and more about her father's role in all of it. Without warning, the door to the records room creaked open again, and Zoe froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Harding, he hadn't left. His footsteps echoed through the room, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice low. "There's more you need to know. I shouldn't be telling you this, but you don't have much time." Zoe stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to the small bag at her side. "What is it?" Harding moved closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "You're being watched. They know you're here, and they know you're getting closer to the truth." Zoe's stomach churned. The sense of being hunted was palpable. She had felt it before, that strange unease creeping over her, but now it was real. Someone, somewhere, was aware of their every move. "You need to leave. Now," Harding urged, his voice suddenly filled with urgency. "There's a safe house, a place where you can hide until things calm down. It's your only chance." Carla's eyes flashed with suspicion. "Why are you helping us now? You weren't exactly forthcoming before." Harding's expression darkened, and for a moment, Zoe saw something else, regret, maybe guilt. Because you're in too deep now. You don't realize it, but you're not just looking for answers. You're standing in the middle of a war that's been brewing for years. Your father was the key to something big, and now they think you have that key. They're going to do everything they can to get it from you. Zoe's head spun. What are you talking about? What's the key? Harding stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You're asking the right questions, but you're not ready for the answers. You have no idea what your father was mixed up in. You need to leave here now, or they'll come after you next. Zoe looked at her mother, then back at Harding. She could feel the pull of uncertainty weighing her down. There was so much they didn't know, and they were up against something so much bigger than them. But she couldn't back down. Not when they were this close to the truth. We're not leaving, Zoe said, her voice steady despite the growing fear inside her. We need the answers, Harding. We're not running. Harding stared at her for a moment, as if weighing her resolve. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if resigned to something he couldn't change. Fine. But if you're staying, you need to be smart about this. Don't trust anyone who offers you help. There are too many people with their own agendas. Before Zoe could ask more, a sound echoed down the hallway, the unmistakable clatter of footsteps growing closer. Harding's eyes widened in alarm. You're not safe here, he said urgently. Go, now. Without waiting for them to respond, he grabbed a large file from one of the shelves and tossed it to Zoe. This is what you need to know. It's a start. But be careful. It's just the beginning. Zoe caught the file instinctively, the weight of it heavy in her hands. What's in it? She asked, but Harding was already turning away, his movements quick and deliberate. Everything you need to find the truth, he muttered over his shoulder. But don't trust it all. Not everything is what it seems. Carla grabbed Zoe's arm, pulling her toward the door. We have to go, Zoe. This isn't worth the risk anymore. Zoe hesitated for a split second, her eyes darting between Harding and the door, then to the file in her hands. Her mind raced with the implications of everything Harding had said. The truth was getting closer, but so was danger. The footsteps grew louder. Zoe turned and ran, following Carla down the hallway, Max at their heels. The file was still clutched tightly in her hands, and with each step, the weight of it seemed to grow heavier. She didn't know what was inside, but she knew one thing, it was the only thing standing between her and the answers they so desperately needed. As they rounded a corner, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The oppressive silence of the courthouse now felt like a ticking clock, each moment bringing them closer to something unknown, something deadly. They reached the elevator, and Zoe hit the button with frantic urgency. As the doors slid open, she felt a chill run through her. Someone was out there. Someone who had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The elevator doors closed, and they descended in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The feeling of being hunted had never been more real. The file in Zoe's hands was the only thing that could save them now. But what would happen when they finally read it? The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Zoe stepped out, her heart still pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the file in her hands, each page pressing down on her as if it were both a lifeline and a ticking time bomb. The quiet hum of the building seemed louder now, echoing in her ears as she and Carla hurried down the hallway toward the exit. Max, who had been unusually quiet, trotted beside them, his ears perked, sensing something was off. The air in the courthouse felt thicker now, almost suffocating, as though it had absorbed all the tension from the last few days and was holding it in a silent grip. Carla glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as if she expected someone to be following them. Zoe, we need to get out of here. Fast. I know, Zoe replied, her voice tense. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. The file was a lead, maybe the lead, that would finally connect all the dots. But there were too many pieces missing, too many unknowns. They reached the lobby, and Zoe pushed open the heavy glass doors, feeling a rush of cold air greet her as she stepped outside. The street was quieter than usual, the sound of distant traffic the only thing breaking the stillness. The city felt far removed from the chaos and danger she had just left behind, but Zoe knew better than to believe in such false comforts. The courthouse had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where truth should have prevailed. But now, it was just another battlefield. Carla led the way to their car, but Zoe held back for a moment, her eyes scanning the street. Was she imagining things, or had someone been standing near the courthouse entrance just a moment ago? She couldn't be sure, but a figure in a dark coat had been leaning against a nearby lamppost, watching them intently. When she turned her gaze toward him, he was gone. "Zoe," Carla called softly from the car, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" Zoe quickly shook off the unease, forcing herself to push forward. She had to focus on what came next. No time for distractions. She slid into the passenger seat, the door closing with a solid thunk. Carla's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she started the car and pulled out into traffic. The ride was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Zoe's mind kept returning to the file in her lap, its contents a mystery that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. She needed answers, real answers, but she didn't even know where to start. "Do you think Harding was telling the truth?" Carla asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "He sounded like he was really trying to help, but I don't know. I'm not sure if we can trust him." Zoe glanced over at her mother. She could see the doubt in Carla's eyes, the same doubt that was creeping into her own heart. But the urgency in Harding's voice had been real, too real to ignore. "I don't know," Zoe admitted. "But if he's telling the truth, we have to find out what's in that file. We can't afford to wait any longer." Carla nodded but didn't say anything more. Instead, she drove on, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Zoe tried to focus, but her mind was spinning. What had Harding meant by the key? Was it some piece of evidence that her father had hidden? Was it something that could destroy everything? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carla pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex. They parked in their usual spot, and Zoe turned to Carla, her eyes hardening with determination. "Let's go inside. I need to look at the file now." Carla hesitated, glancing down at the parking lot before meeting Zoe's gaze. "We need to be careful, Zoe. The last thing we want is to expose ourselves too soon." "I know," Zoe said, her voice tight. "But we've already gone this far. We can't stop now." Carla gave a reluctant nod, and the two of them walked up to their apartment. Zoe's mind was still racing, her thoughts a jumble of possibilities and fears. What could be so dangerous in that file? And why had Harding gone to such lengths to warn them? Inside, Zoe wasted no time. She grabbed the file from her bag and sat down at the small kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped open the first page. The paper was old, the edges yellowed with age, and the ink was faded in places, as if it had been handled too many times. The first page contained only a single line of text, written in a neat, formal hand. "To the one who holds this document, know that what is contained herein is not for the faint of heart." Zoe frowned, turning the page. The next sheet was covered in dense, legal language, names she didn't recognize, and dates that seemed to stretch back years. The case files were more complex than anything she had seen before, far beyond the trial they had been investigating. This was a conspiracy, one that reached deep into the core of the legal system. Zoe's eyes skimmed the names, her mind racing as she tried to piece them together. One name stood out immediately, George Wills. It was her father's former colleague, a name Zoe had heard in passing, but never given much thought. Wills had always been a shadow in her father's life, distant but somehow important. But now, seeing his name in this file, Zoe knew that George Wills was more than just a bystander. He had been a key player. "I think we've found something," Zoe murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Carla leaned over her shoulder, looking at the page with a frown. "Who's George Wills? What does he have to do with any of this?" Zoe scanned the document further. The more she read, the more it became clear. Wills wasn't just involved in the shady deals of the past, he was one of the architects. He had been part of the operation that had manipulated evidence, planted false information, and suppressed key testimonies in court cases. Wills was a puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and her father had been his ally, even if Zoe hadn't realized it at the time. But there was something else in the file, something that made Zoe's stomach drop. A photo. It was grainy, old, but the faces were unmistakable. Her father, young and smiling, standing next to none other than George Wills. They were at an event, a fundraiser of some kind, their arms around each other as if they were the best of friends. But the most shocking part was the third person in the photo, a man Zoe had never seen before, but whose face sent a chill down her spine. The man was tall, with sharp features and dark, calculating eyes. He looked nothing like the kind of person Zoe would ever want to be associated with. "This man," Zoe whispered, her voice shaking. "I've seen him before. At the courthouse." Carla looked at the photo, her eyes narrowing. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Zoe replied, her breath catching. "But I'm going to find out." As Zoe stared at the photo, her mind was racing. Whoever this man was, he was somehow connected to the web of corruption her father had been entangled in. And now, he was connected to Zoe. She could feel it in her bones. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival. They weren't just up against the system anymore. They were up against a network of people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And Zoe had no idea how deep it went. Zoe sat in the small kitchen of their apartment, her fingers trembling as she slowly folded the last page of the file. She had gone through it with Carla, piece by piece, dissecting every name, every document, every cryptic note, but it all felt like a tangled web that only grew more complicated the deeper they went. George Wills had been involved in everything, the manipulation of evidence, falsification of testimonies, and most shockingly, the cover-up of several high-profile cases. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that Zoe's father had been directly involved with Wills, on the same side of the law, a part of the conspiracy she never could have imagined. And the third figure in the photograph, who was he? Zoe's heart raced every time she thought about the dark eyes staring back at her from the grainy image. He was the key to everything, but there was nothing about him in the file. No name. No background. No explanation. "Mom," Zoe said softly, her voice catching in her throat as she looked up at Carla. "This man, whoever he is, he's connected to my father. And I think he's watching us." Carla's eyes darkened with concern as she looked down at the photo Zoe had been staring at for the past hour. "He looks dangerous, Zoe. Whoever he is, he's not someone you want to mess with." Zoe's thoughts raced. How had she missed it all? Her father had kept so many secrets from her, and now she was starting to wonder if he had been more involved in this than just as an unwitting pawn. It felt like the more they uncovered, the more questions they had, and the closer they were getting to a truth they might not survive. Carla sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We need to figure out who he is. That photo could be the only link we have to this man. If we find him, we can find out who's pulling all the strings." Zoe nodded. But how could they possibly track him down? There were no leads. No name. No clue as to where he might be. The file had given them nothing except for a glimpse into a much bigger world, one that was filled with shadowy figures, power, and corruption. "Maybe we could ask around at the courthouse," Zoe suggested. "People must know who he is. Someone must have seen him before." Carla gave her a skeptical look. You're not seriously thinking of walking back into that courthouse, are you? It's a battlefield, Zoe. We've already been lucky enough to get out without attracting attention. If this man is as dangerous as you think he is, we can't afford to put ourselves in that position again. Zoe stared at the file for a moment, then sighed. Her mother was right. But they couldn't ignore the truth staring them in the face. Whoever this man was, he was at the center of everything. And now that they had a photo, they were even more exposed. What if we go to the police? Zoe asked, voicing the question that had been bouncing around in her head. If this conspiracy goes as deep as we think, maybe they can help us. Carla's face hardened. No. We can't trust the police. You've seen how things work in this town. They're either involved or too scared to do anything. If we go to them, we're just handing over the information to the people who are trying to destroy us. Zoe's shoulders slumped, feeling the weight of Carla's words. Where could they turn? Who could they trust? The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the thick silence in the room. Zoe jumped, her heart racing. For a moment, neither she nor Carla moved. They both stared at the phone as if it might bite. Finally, Carla picked up the receiver. Hello. There was a long pause, and then Zoe heard a voice, low, urgent, and familiar. It was Robert Harding. Carla, Zoe, listen to me. Harding's voice came through the receiver, tinged with a sense of panic. I don't have much time. I need you both to leave your apartment. Now. You're in immediate danger. Zoe's stomach dropped. What's going on? What do you mean, danger? There are people coming for you. The ones I warned you about, whoever they are, they've found you. They're already on their way. Carla's eyes went wide as she quickly grabbed Zoe's hand, pulling her toward the door. We have to go, Zoe. We need to move. Now. Zoe's mind raced. Was this the enemy they had been running from? Had they finally tracked them down? Her heart thudded in her chest as she grabbed her bag, shoving the file inside it. What do we do? Zoe asked, trying to steady her breathing. Get in the car, Harding urged. I'll send someone to meet you. They'll take you to a safe house. Trust me, it's the only way you'll survive this. Before Zoe could respond, the line went dead. Carla didn't waste a second. She grabbed Zoe's arm and pulled her toward the front door. As they reached the hallway, Zoe heard the faintest sound, distant but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard, followed by the faint shuffle of footsteps. Someone was close. Very close. Carla's face tightened with fear. Move. Now. They rushed down the stairs, their feet pounding against the wooden steps. Max was at their heels, his body tense, sensing the danger in the air. When they reached the parking lot, Zoe's mind was spinning. She had no idea who was after them or what had just happened, but one thing was clear, they couldn't stay there any longer. Carla fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. When the car door finally clicked open, they both jumped in, and Carla slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and they sped out of the parking lot, barely giving the complex a second glance. Where are we going? Zoe asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Carla said, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Harding said someone would meet us, but I'm not sure who. All we can do is keep driving and hope we're not followed. The streets outside seemed empty, but Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. It wasn't just paranoia. Something about the way Harding had sounded, it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. A desperate cry for help. And now they were tangled in the middle of something so much bigger than either of them could have imagined. Mom, what if they find us? Zoe whispered, her breath catching in her throat. We keep running, Carla replied, her voice tight. We keep running until we have nowhere left to go. Zoe looked out the window as the cityscape blurred past. There was no safe place anymore. No place to hide. All they had was each other. And whatever secret this file held. Zoe's hands were clenched tightly around the strap of her bag, the file buried inside. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she sat in the passenger seat of the car, staring out of the window. The streets blurred past her, and every passing light felt like a countdown, counting down to something she couldn't see, but knew was coming. Carla's grip on the steering wheel was unrelenting, her knuckles white as she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. They had been driving for what seemed like hours, weaving through unfamiliar streets, trying to shake off any potential pursuers. But despite the increasing distance between them and their apartment, Zoe couldn't help but feel as though the danger was always just a few steps behind them. It was as if they were chasing shadows. "We can't outrun them forever, Carla," Zoe muttered, her voice hoarse. The exhaustion from the last few days had begun to settle in, weighing heavily on her shoulders. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the gnawing feeling in her gut that something was wrong. They weren't just running from some faceless group. They were running from something more calculated, more dangerous. "I know," Carla replied, her voice tight. "But we don't have a choice. Harding said someone would meet us. We just have to trust him." Zoe didn't respond. Trusting Harding wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was the growing sense of helplessness, of being pulled deeper into a situation where every move seemed to lead them closer to a point of no return. There was too much at stake, and too many unknowns. The car hummed along the highway, but Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It wasn't just the quiet in the car. It was something in the air, something she couldn't explain. Her eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of another car following them. But the road was empty. There was nothing in sight. "That's the fifth turn we've taken in the last 20 minutes, Zoe said, her voice laced with suspicion. "Where are we going, exactly?" Carla didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the road, but there was a brief hesitation before she spoke. "Harding told me to go to an old warehouse just outside the city. It's off the radar. He said it's the safest place to go right now." Zoe furrowed her brow. A warehouse? It seemed odd. If they were being hunted, why would they go to a place that sounded so exposed? But before she could voice her doubts, Carla added, "I don't like it either, but we don't have any other options. We need somewhere quiet. Somewhere they won't look." Zoe took a deep breath and nodded. She didn't have any better ideas. "I guess that's as good as any." The quiet tension between them hung in the air as they drove on. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but the world outside seemed to blur into an indistinct gray. The isolation of the empty road was unsettling. Zoe couldn't tell if it was the solitude or the weight of the secrets they were carrying, but every mile felt like it was taking them further away from everything they knew, and closer to something they couldn't control. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Carla turned onto a dirt road that veered off the main highway. The car bounced and rattled as they drove deeper into the countryside, the streetlights fading behind them, replaced by nothing but the occasional flicker of moonlight. The sound of the tires on gravel was the only noise in the car. "Almost there," Carla muttered, her voice tight with nerves. Zoe glanced out the window, her eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was oppressive, as if the world had gone still, waiting. Minutes later, they pulled up to a large, dilapidated warehouse at the edge of a small industrial area. It looked abandoned, a hulking structure with broken windows and rusted doors. It was the perfect place to hide, if they could be sure no one else was already there. Carla parked the car in a shadowed corner of the lot, and the two women sat in silence for a moment. Zoe felt her heart pounding in her chest, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. "This place doesn't feel right," Zoe whispered. The air was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "I know," Carla replied softly. "But we've come this far. We don't have much choice." They both got out of the car, Max following close behind them. The dog's ears were perked, and he sniffed the air, his body tense. Zoe could feel the tension radiating off him. He was just as alert, just as uneasy, as they were. Carla led the way to the warehouse's rusted metal door. She reached for the handle, but before she could turn it, there was a sound behind them. A scraping noise, faint but unmistakable. Zoe spun around, her pulse quickening. Nothing. Her eyes scanned the parking lot, the shadows swallowing everything. But she saw no one. "Did you hear that?" Zoe asked, her voice a little more frantic now. Carla didn't answer immediately, her eyes narrowing as she looked around. Then, without a word, she pushed open the door to the warehouse. The inside was dark, save for the pale glow of the moonlight streaming through cracks in the walls. It smelled of dust and mildew, and the floor creaked beneath their feet as they stepped further in. Max was already sniffing the ground, his tail held low. "Harding said someone would meet us here," Carla whispered, her voice full of doubt. "Where are they?" Zoe couldn't answer. The emptiness of the warehouse was suffocating. It felt wrong. They should have been here by now, whoever was supposed to help them. Instead, all they had was the eerie quiet. Then, a voice echoed through the vast, empty space. "Zoe. Carla. I knew you'd come." Zoe froze. The voice wasn't Harding's. It was deeper, more menacing, and it came from somewhere in the shadows. A figure stepped out from behind a pillar. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap that obscured most of his face, but Zoe didn't need to see his expression to know who he was. The man from the photograph. The one who had haunted her thoughts for days. "You," Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who are you?" The man smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating, like a predator watching its prey. "I think you know exactly who I am," he said smoothly, stepping closer. "And I think you know why you're here." Zoe's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, instinctively reaching for Carla's arm. Max growled, but the man didn't flinch. "We've been watching you, Zoe," he continued. "Every move you've made. Every step you've taken. You're getting too close to the truth. And that, my dear, is something we can't allow." Carla stepped forward, her voice fierce. "You're behind this. You're the one pulling the strings." The man laughed softly, a sound that chilled Zoe to her core. "You think it's that simple? There's much more at play here than you can possibly imagine." The shadows seemed to close in around them. There was no escape. No backup. Only the cold, harsh truth: they had walked right into the heart of the conspiracy. And now, it was time for the final game to begin. The man stepped forward out of the shadows, his presence consuming the dimly lit warehouse. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding harder in her chest. Her mind was a blur, she knew she had to think, had to find a way out, but her body felt frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. Carla, however, wasn't standing still. She took a step forward, her hand instinctively reaching for her pocket, where she kept a small pistol, her only form of protection in a world that was quickly spinning out of control. The man noticed her movement but didn't flinch. His eyes, dark and calculating, seemed to take in every inch of their surroundings as if he knew this warehouse like the back of his hand. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Zoe could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Do you really think that will help you?" the man asked, his voice cold, smooth like ice, as he looked at Carla. "You think a gun will stop me? It won't. It's not me you need to be worried about." Carla's grip tightened around the handle of her gun, her jaw set in determination. "I'm not afraid of you." Zoe could see the uncertainty in Carla's eyes, though, just the faintest flicker of doubt. This man wasn't just dangerous, he was different. There was a calm in him that sent chills down her spine. He was someone who had seen it all, someone who was untouchable. The man smiled faintly, his lips curling into a cruel, knowing grin. You should be. You think you've uncovered something important, something you can use against me. But the truth is, you have no idea what you're up against. You don't even understand the full picture yet. Zoe swallowed, her mind racing. The full picture. She had thought she was piecing things together, one discovery after another, each revelation leading them closer to understanding the conspiracy that had ensnared her family. But now, in front of this man, she was starting to feel like they had only scratched the surface. What do you want from us? Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could barely keep her hands from trembling, her chest tightening with fear. Why are you doing this? Why the games, the secrecy? Why us? The man's eyes flickered to Zoe, and then to Carla, before his gaze returned to the darkness around them. You have something I need, he said, his voice low, almost like a secret he was unwilling to share. You've seen the file. You've seen the evidence. That's all well and good, but it's only a small part of a much larger plan. Zoe could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of his words sank in. She had seen the file, she had seen the names, the connections, the way everything tied back to her father. But this man was suggesting something bigger. Something far beyond the scope of what they had uncovered so far. What do you mean? Carla asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. What larger plan? Who are you working for? The man's eyes darkened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, anger, maybe, or fear, that passed across his face. He quickly masked it, replacing it with a calm facade. You wouldn't understand. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're getting too close to the truth. And I can't let that happen. Carla moved again, stepping closer to Zoe, but this time, she was careful not to make any sudden moves. What are you going to do? Kill us? The man's laugh was low and chilling. No. Killing you would be far too easy. I'm not here to waste your lives. I'm here to ensure that you don't interfere with what's already in motion. Zoe's mind was spinning. What's in motion? What did he mean by that? And how could they possibly stop someone like him, someone who had all the pieces, who was steps ahead? She looked at Carla, whose face was hard with determination, yet she could see the fear too. They were trapped, caught in a game they didn't fully understand, with a man who knew exactly how to play it. For a split second, the man glanced around the warehouse again, as though making sure they were alone. Zoe's instincts kicked in. Something was off. This wasn't just about intimidation or threats, there was something deeper at play. Before she could say anything, the man turned abruptly and motioned for them to follow. You'll find out soon enough. But for now, I'm giving you a choice. You can keep running, trying to piece together your pathetic little puzzle, or you can come with me and see the real picture. The choice is yours. Zoe didn't know whether it was the desperation in his voice or the sharp edge of his words, but something about his offer felt like a trap. It felt like bait, meant to lure them further into a situation where they would have no way out. No, Zoe said firmly, her voice finally steady. We'll figure this out on our own. The man's smile faltered for a moment, as if surprised by her defiance. Then, his expression turned icy once again. Very well. But just remember, Zoe, you've been warned. The truth is always harder to swallow than the lie. And once you start chasing it, there's no going back. With that, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the warehouse, leaving Zoe and Carla alone once again. Max was growling lowly, sensing the danger that still lingered in the air. Zoe could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. Carla exhaled slowly, finally lowering the gun. We can't stay here. If he's right, if there's more to this than we even know, we need to get ahead of it. We can't waste any more time. Zoe nodded, her mind reeling. We need to figure out who's really behind this. He's not the one calling the shots, there's someone higher up, someone even more dangerous. Carla shook her head, her expression grim. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever that someone might be. But I do know one thing, we have to find out, or we'll never have any peace again. The thought of digging deeper into this mess, knowing how dangerous it was, made Zoe's stomach turn. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't walk away. They had come too far. There was no turning back. We'll find them, Zoe said, her voice stronger than she felt. And we'll stop them. But as they walked toward the exit of the warehouse, Zoe couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late. The man had said it himself, once you start chasing the truth, there's no going back. And in that moment, Zoe felt like they had crossed a line from which they might never return. The moon hung high in the night sky, casting a silver sheen across the abandoned streets as Zoe and Carla left the warehouse behind them. The air was thick with unease, and every creak of the floorboards in the warehouse seemed to echo in Zoe's mind. The man's words replayed over and over in her thoughts, his promises of a larger plan, and his cryptic warning that they were getting too close to the truth. But what was the truth? What had they stumbled upon? As the two women drove away from the scene, the weight of the situation felt heavier with each passing mile. Zoe couldn't help but feel like they were walking blindfolded down a dark hallway. They had been chasing something, some truth, some hidden answer, but they were now more uncertain than ever if they even knew what they were truly hunting. I can't believe we just let him walk away like that, Carla said, breaking the silence that had hung between them since they left the warehouse. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed straight ahead as she focused on the road. Zoe leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her breathing. We didn't have a choice. We could have shot him, but it would have just made things worse. He's playing some game, and we can't win by playing by his rules. Carla was quiet for a moment. But what is his game, Zoe? What's his end goal? Zoe had no answers. The man's smile, his cold, calculating demeanor, haunted her thoughts. He had seemed so sure of himself, so in control. And now, she realized, they were the ones at a disadvantage. They had no real leverage, no clue where the next move would come from. I don't know, Zoe finally replied, the words feeling like lead in her mouth. But we need to find out. We need to figure out what he's really after and who else is involved. Carla nodded, her expression hardening. We will. I won't stop until I find out who's behind this. Zoe was grateful for Carla's strength, but part of her feared that the deeper they dug, the more they would lose themselves in a world of lies and deceit that they might never be able to escape. Max, the dog, shifted restlessly in the back seat, as if sensing their tension. Zoe reached back absent-mindedly to stroke his fur, a small comfort amidst the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. As they turned onto a quiet street, Zoe glanced at the map on her phone. They were heading to a small motel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't ideal, but it was the safest place they could find for the moment. The last thing they needed was to be followed or found by anyone who might be watching them. When they arrived at the motel, the small neon sign flickered weakly in the night. It was hardly a sanctuary, but it would have to do. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few worn-down cars. Carla parked and the two women stepped out of the car, stretching their stiff limbs and taking a moment to breathe in the cool air. We should get a room for the night, Carla said, her voice low and cautious. We need to lay low for a while, figure out our next move. Zoe nodded, but as they walked to the front desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the motel, it was everything. The way everything seemed to be spiraling faster than she could keep up with. Inside the dimly lit lobby, the clerk at the desk gave them a distracted nod but didn't make eye contact. He was a thin man with a graying beard, hunched over a book as though he had something far more important than his job to attend to. They rented a room under false names, nothing too elaborate, just enough to keep them off the radar for the night. As soon as the key was in her hand, Zoe turned to Carla. We need to talk. Carla nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I know. Let's get to the room first. They made their way up the rickety stairs to the second floor, the worn carpet beneath their feet making a soft squeaking noise with every step. Zoe's nerves were taut, and she kept glancing behind her, expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. But the hallway was empty, save for the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights above them. Once inside the room, Zoe locked the door behind them, and Carla immediately went to the window, peering through the blinds. Outside, the street was quiet, the world seemingly at rest. But Zoe knew better. Everything was about to change, and they were standing on the edge of a precipice. They sat on the edge of the bed, facing each other. What do we do now? Zoe asked, her voice raw with exhaustion. She felt like they were running in circles, not knowing what the next step should be. They were so close to uncovering the truth, yet it felt like the more they learned, the more they lost control of the situation. Carla paused for a moment, her hands resting on her knees, eyes distant. We need to find Harding. He's the only one who can help us understand all of this. He knows more about what's really going on than anyone else. Zoe frowned. Harding's already told us everything he knows. And besides, I don't trust him. I can't shake the feeling that he's not telling us everything. Then we need to find someone else. Someone who knows the rest of the story, Carla said, her tone unyielding. The file you found, it's just the beginning. There's more to it, Zoe. We're not seeing the whole picture yet. Zoe felt her chest tighten. What was it that they were missing? The file, the clues they'd gathered, it all seemed so interconnected. But there were gaps, things that didn't make sense. How was her father connected to all of this? Why had he been so involved in something so dangerous? And why was this man, this shadowy figure, so interested in her now? She looked at Carla, her eyes filled with questions. But who else is there? Where do we even start? Carla bit her lip, her brow furrowing as she thought. I don't know. But we can't afford to be cautious anymore. Whoever's behind this, whoever he is, he's not playing fair. If we're going to stop this, we need to act fast. No more waiting. No more hiding. Zoe nodded, her resolve hardening. This was bigger than they had imagined. And it was time to stop running from it. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Zoe's heart skipped a beat. She turned to Carla, who had already moved toward the door, her hand hovering near her pocket where her gun was hidden. Zoe slowly approached, her breath shallow. Carla motioned for Zoe to stay back, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. After a few seconds, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Who is it? Carla called, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. No answer. Zoe's pulse raced. Something didn't feel right. Her instincts were screaming at her to stay away from the door. They were being watched. Carla looked at her, her expression unreadable. Stay behind me, she whispered. With a swift motion, she cracked open the door, just enough to peer outside. Zoe could barely make out a figure standing at the threshold, too tall, too still. Before either of them could react, a voice came from the darkness. I think it's time we had a real conversation. The voice outside the door was low and controlled, almost too calm for comfort. Zoe felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. Who was standing outside their door? Was it the man from the warehouse? Someone else connected to the conspiracy? Carla's fingers tightened around the handle of her gun, but Zoe could see that she was hesitating. She wasn't sure whether to confront whoever was out there or stay silent, waiting for more clues. Zoe knew the feeling all too well, the paranoia creeping in, making every sound seem louder, every shadow darker. But they couldn't afford to make the wrong move. Who are you? Carla demanded, her voice steady, though Zoe could hear the tension underneath. She kept her eyes locked on the door, ready for whatever might come next. There was a brief silence, followed by a soft chuckle. "Oh, I think you know exactly who I am," the voice replied, a hint of amusement lacing its words. "But I suppose introductions are in order." Before Zoe could process the words, the door slowly creaked open. Not enough to let anyone in, but enough to reveal a silhouette standing just outside the threshold. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that looked too expensive for this run-down motel. His face was partially obscured by the dim light in the hallway, but Zoe's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the sharp features. It was Harding. Harding, the man they thought they could trust. Zoe felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Harding? What was he doing here? The man they had once believed was just a well-meaning whistleblower now stood at their door like an intruder, his calm demeanor hiding something far darker beneath the surface. Harding. Carla's voice was incredulous, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't think I would let you dig into this without offering a little guidance, did you?" He stepped closer, the shadows now fully enveloping his face. His eyes were colder than ever, filled with something Zoe couldn't quite place: regret? Guilt? Or perhaps something more sinister? "What do you want from us?" Zoe demanded, her heart pounding. She had to stop herself from taking a step back. She had known Harding to be secretive, but this felt like a betrayal. "I want to help you," Harding said, though his voice held no warmth, only a calculated precision. "In fact, I think we're past the point of pretending you don't need me." Carla raised an eyebrow, a sharp look of suspicion on her face. "Help us? You've been lying to us this whole time, Harding. How do we know we can trust you now?" Harding seemed unfazed by Carla's accusation. "Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already. I've been watching you, Zoe, Carla. You've come too far to turn back now. You've uncovered too much, and that's why I'm here." Zoe felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She stepped forward, ignoring the slight tremor in her hands. "What do you mean, you've been watching us? Who the hell are you really?" Harding's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flash of something real, behind his eyes. He sighed, a long, weary sound, before pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. Zoe didn't stop him. She couldn't. He was already too close. "I didn't want this," Harding said, his voice almost a whisper now. "I didn't want any of this. But things got out of hand. I got in too deep. And now, there's no way out. Not for me, not for you." Zoe felt a shiver run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the panic she was trying so hard to suppress. Harding moved toward the bed and sat down, not waiting for an invitation. The weight of his presence in the small room made the air feel heavy, suffocating. He ran a hand through his hair, looking older and more tired than Zoe remembered. His once sharp, confident demeanor now seemed shattered, as though he had seen too much, done too much. "The truth is," he started, his voice now low and hesitant, "everything you've learned, all of it, it's bigger than you realize. I've been a part of it for years, ever since your father got involved. But even I didn't know how far it would go. You're in the middle of something much darker than I ever imagined." Carla's eyes narrowed. "Your father? What does this have to do with Zoe's father?" Harding's eyes flicked to Zoe, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something resembling regret. "I was supposed to protect you, Zoe. But I failed. I was part of a system, a network, that your father was working for. And now it's come full circle." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. "What network? What are you talking about?" Harding hesitated, his eyes shifting as though considering whether to continue. The weight of his silence pressed heavily on them, but then, finally, he spoke. "Your father was involved in a covert operation, one that went wrong. People died. Lies were made. And now, There's a power struggle happening behind the scenes. Your father knew too much. But he didn't realize how dangerous it was. And now you've walked into it, Zoe. You've opened the door to things you weren't meant to see. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. But he's dead. My father's gone. Why are you telling me all of this now? Why didn't you say something sooner? Harding stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Because I couldn't. I was trying to protect you, trying to keep you safe, but I've failed. I didn't realize the full extent of it until now. The people your father was mixed up with, they're dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to protect their interests. And you're a target because of what you know now. Zoe's mind was reeling. Every answer Harding gave raised more questions. Her father's death had never made sense, but now, the pieces were beginning to fit together in ways she wasn't ready to accept. Carla stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. So you're telling us that everything we've uncovered so far, everything we thought we were doing, was all part of some bigger game? And now, we're supposed to trust you? After everything you've kept from us? Harding's gaze softened, just for a moment, before he spoke again. I never wanted this. But I'm telling you now, because you have no choice. You've stumbled too deep into this mess, and if you want to survive, if you want to stop what's coming, you need to trust me. I can help you, if you let me. Zoe took a step back, her thoughts swirling. She had no idea who to trust anymore. Everyone around her had been hiding something, and now, even Harding, the one person she thought she could count on, was revealing himself to be just as deep into this conspiracy as anyone else. But one thing was clear, whatever this was, it was far from over. And the worst was yet to come. Zoe stared at Harding, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Every moment of the past few weeks, every clue, every conversation, now felt like a distorted piece of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. She had trusted Harding, hell, they had all trusted him. And now he was telling them that her father, the man who had died in the middle of it all, had been a part of something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. I can't trust you, Zoe whispered, her voice shaky. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice failed her. You've lied to me. All this time, you've kept me in the dark. Harding's face darkened, his expression turning somber. I never wanted to lie to you, Zoe. But I was protecting you. Protecting both of you. The truth is I never thought it would get this bad. I thought I could control it, keep it contained. But now it's too late. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. And you think telling me all this now is supposed to make me trust you? Do you even understand what you've put me through? My father's dead. I've been dragged into this mess, and I'm supposed to believe you're trying to help me? Carla, who had been silently observing the conversation, stepped forward, her expression grim. Zoe, he's right about one thing, she said, her voice steady. We don't have a choice anymore. We're already too deep in this. And Harding might be the only person who can help us get out. Or at least figure out how to stop what's coming. Zoe shot Carla a sharp look. You're not seriously considering this, are you? After everything he's done? Carla met her gaze without flinching. I'm not saying we trust him completely. But we don't have the luxury of ignoring what he's offering. Not anymore. Zoe closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. It felt like the world was spinning out of control, and she had no way to stop it. She had thought she was doing the right thing by uncovering the truth, but now it seemed like the truth was just another lie wrapped in a darker secret. What had her father been involved in? Who were these people that Harding was warning them about? Tell me everything, Zoe finally said, her voice trembling. Tell me what's really going on. If you want me to believe you, then you have to lay it all out. No more half-truths. Harding nodded, his eyes filled with regret. He exhaled slowly before he began speaking, his voice low and steady. Your father, he was part of a covert operation. It wasn't just about business, Zoe. It was about power. The people he worked for, the people I worked for, they were using him. And when he started to realize how deep it went, he wanted out. He wanted to expose everything. But they wouldn't let him. Zoe felt her stomach churn as Harding continued. They were involved in a network of high-level government and corporate figures. They controlled everything behind the scenes: money, resources, influence. And when your father tried to break free, they made sure he couldn't. They killed him, Zoe. They made it look like an accident, but it wasn't. It was murder. Carla's hand gripped the back of the chair, her knuckles turning white. And you? Where do you fit into this? Harding's face tightened, his gaze dropping to the floor. I was their informant. I was in too deep to pull out. But I couldn't stop him either. I couldn't stop your father from trying to expose them. And now, he trailed off, his voice heavy with a mixture of guilt and fear. Now, they know you're looking for answers. They know you've uncovered the file. And they won't stop until they have you, too. Zoe's heart raced. You mean, they'll kill me too? Harding nodded, his expression grim. If you don't stop now, if you don't walk away from this, they'll make sure you never see the light of day again. Zoe's mind was spinning. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at a chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. Everything she had believed in, everything she had trusted, now seemed like a lie. Her father's death, Harding's role in it, the conspiracy, it was all so much bigger than she had ever imagined. But what choice did she have? Was she supposed to walk away? Could she walk away? We have to stop them, Carla said, her voice suddenly fierce. We can't let them win. We're too close to the truth. Zoe turned to her, torn. She could see the fire in Carla's eyes. She knew that Carla was right. They couldn't just walk away. Not after everything they had uncovered. But the cost was so high. The danger was so real. Zoe, Harding spoke again, his voice softer this time. I can help you. I have connections. I can get you the resources you need to fight back. But you have to trust me. If you go after them alone, they'll bury you. And you'll never get the answers you need. Zoe looked at him, her heart heavy with indecision. She had no idea who to trust anymore. She had thought Harding was on her side, but now it felt like everyone she had known was part of the system that had killed her father, and they were all just trying to cover their tracks. I don't know if I can trust you, Zoe said, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't have a choice, do I? Harding's eyes softened. No. You don't. The room fell silent, the weight of their choices hanging in the air. Zoe's mind raced, but one thing was clear, she couldn't stop now. The truth had been laid out in front of her, and there was no turning back. She looked at Carla, who gave her a small nod of reassurance. We'll do this together, Carla said, her voice firm. We'll figure this out. But we need Harding's help. For now. Zoe took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. All right. Let's do it. Harding stood up, a sense of urgency returning to his movements. We need to move fast. There's no time to waste. They know you're here, and they'll be coming for you. Zoe nodded, her heart pounding. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. But she was ready. She had to be. Because if she didn't keep going, if she didn't fight back, then everything her father had died for would have been for nothing. And she wouldn't let that happen. The night outside was still, an eerie silence hanging over the small motel room as Zoe, Carla, and Harding gathered their thoughts. Everything had come to a boiling point. Zoe had made her decision, there was no turning back. She couldn't let her father's death be in vain, nor could she live with the knowledge that there were powerful forces out there, pulling strings, destroying lives, and getting away with it. The air in the room was thick with tension as Harding paced back and forth, preparing them for what lay ahead. "We don't have much time," he muttered, checking his watch nervously. "They know we're in town, and they'll be expecting a move soon. We have to act fast. If we don't, we'll be trapped here with no way out." Zoe felt the weight of his words sinking in. The choices they had made brought them to this point, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. And yet, she had no choice but to keep going. "Where do we go from here?" Carla asked, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Harding stopped pacing and looked them both in the eye. "We need to find the people who were behind your father's death, the ones who thought they could bury the truth. We have to expose them, or they'll just keep covering their tracks. If we're going to have any chance of taking them down, we need the evidence. We need to find the files." Zoe's pulse quickened. "The files? What files?" Harding leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The ones your father gathered before he died. Everything he was working on. The names, the transactions, the proof that connects the conspiracy. It's all in a secure location. I know where it is." Carla raised an eyebrow. "And you've known this all along? Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Harding's eyes flickered with regret. "Because it's dangerous. If I had led you to it before, they would have caught on too soon. But now, we don't have a choice. The files are the key to everything, and we can't let them fall into the wrong hands. They'll stop at nothing to keep them hidden." Zoe clenched her fists, her heart hammering. "Where are they?" "They're in a safe house," Harding explained, his voice calm but urgent. "It's a secure location, but we don't have much time. We need to get there before they do. If we're lucky, we might have a chance to take them down from the inside. But if we fail, it's over." The room fell silent as Zoe processed everything. The truth about her father, the conspiracy, the people behind it all, it was all connected. But now, with the files as their last hope, the stakes were higher than ever. "Let's do it," Zoe said, her voice firm. She turned to Carla, who nodded in agreement. "We can't back down now." Harding's expression softened for a moment, but it quickly turned serious again. "Good. But remember, this is a game of survival. We have to stay one step ahead, or we'll never make it." They quickly packed up their things, gathering what little equipment they had left. Zoe's mind raced as she zipped up her bag. She could feel the pressure building, the knowledge that everything she had been through had led her to this moment. There was no turning back now. Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the empty streets. The world felt distant, like they were no longer a part of it. Zoe's thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear: she had to do this for her father, for herself, for Carla, and for everyone who had been hurt by the web of lies that had been spun around them. Harding led them to an unmarked car parked at the edge of the parking lot. He glanced around quickly before opening the door for Zoe and Carla. "We need to move fast. No stops, no distractions. We can't risk being followed." Zoe slid into the back seat, her nerves on edge. She glanced at Carla, who was already checking her weapon, preparing for whatever might come next. They had no idea what awaited them, but they had no choice but to keep going. As they drove through the darkened streets, Harding remained quiet, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. Zoe tried to calm her breathing, but the adrenaline was starting to pump through her veins. The last few days had been a blur of danger, uncertainty, and betrayal, but now they were on the edge of something bigger. Something that could change everything. "The safe house is about 20 minutes away," Harding said, his voice breaking the silence. "We'll be there soon, but don't let your guard down. They'll be expecting us." Zoe nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the seat as the car sped through the streets. She felt like she was on the brink of something monumental, but she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Every step felt like it was taking her closer to a point of no return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of the city. The road ahead became narrower, the buildings more sparse. The car slowed as Harding turned onto a long, unmarked driveway. The trees around them grew thicker, blocking out the light from the city. "This is it," Harding said. "Stay close. No matter what happens, we get the files, and we get out." "Understood." Carla and Zoe both nodded, their expressions hardening with determination. They had no other option. It was now or never. The car came to a stop in front of a small, inconspicuous house surrounded by trees. Harding glanced around once more before opening his door and stepping out. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Zoe followed, her heart racing as they approached the house. They moved in the shadows, their footsteps silent on the gravel. Zoe's mind was filled with questions, but there was no time to ask. They had to move quickly. Harding led them to the back door of the house. He checked the lock before turning to them. "This is it. We go in, get the files, and get out. No mistakes." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what everything had been leading to. Her father's death, the conspiracy, the endless questions, everything was about to be revealed. She followed Harding inside, the musty scent of the house filling her nostrils. The air was thick with tension, but Zoe felt something else, too. A sense of finality. This was the moment that would change everything. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, and Zoe's heart skipped a beat. Harding froze. "They're here," he whispered. Before Zoe could respond, the door slammed shut behind them. And then, all hell broke loose. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?